to our YouTube channel. This is another edition of social political thought, and then we're treating consciencism, philosophy and ideology for decolonization and development. Kwame Nkrumah's social and political thoughts. So this is what we are going to look at for today. Our learning objectives for today is we're going to explain the core ideas in consciencism, analyze the crisis of consciencism in Africa, evaluate Nkrumah's proposed solution, which is socialism in the context of Africa, and discuss the implications and confusions of consciencism. So over here, you see a title page of a book cover, which is titled Consciencism, Philosophy and Ideology for Decolonization and Development, with practical reference to the African Revolution of 1964. So this was Nkrumah's attempt to provide Africa with a guideline philosophy after independence. And then the other picture you see on my top right corner is Dr. Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah giving the speech, symbolizing leadership and his persuasive nature as part of his charisma. And then the one you see beneath, which is he done in the nice kente cloth, symbolizing African identity and tradition. Getting to know the background of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and the fact that he was born in Nkrofo, in the Western region in Ghana in 1909, and then the fact that his upbringing from a rural community actually influenced him and gave him a first-hand experience of Africans' communal life, which later shaped consciencism as in what he wrote about. His educational life is he schooled in the U.S., Lincoln University, University of Pennsylvania, and then actually studied theology, philosophy, and then what education. Within this era, he was exposed to some concepts or some ideas from Marxism, Pan-Africanism, and anti-colonial struggles, right? And then also he went to the UK and engaged in some political activities, connected with some Africans and then Caribbean intellectuals. As I said, he has acquainted himself when it comes to Pan-Africanism activities, right, or Pan-African activities. So he played a leading role in organizing the Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1947, alongside WEB, and then George Padmore. Also, let's take note that this is the era he connected with philosophical and political activism. Yeah. In terms of his political leadership, when he came to Ghana, he joined the UGCC and then later broke away from them and formed a party called the CPP. Eventually, in 1957, the party he became the first prime minister of the Republic of Ghana, and 1960 became the president because by then the country became a republic in 1960 and became the president. So that made him the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. That was 1957. So he became the prime minister and later became the president, as I said. So Nkrumah became more like a launch pad for African liberation. When you look through his history, you realize that he was actually also championing some of the cause of other African countries to be able to gain their independence. Then we move straight to some of his key writings. Some of his key writings. Africa Must Unite, the Vision for Political Unity, about the fact he wrote about non-colonialism, warning that independence without economic control is equal to dependency, and consciencism, philosophical foundation of Africa's identity and then what and development. So this is basically some of the background questions I could actually make you understand of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and who he is, and then his educational background, his writings, and then his political leadership. From Nkrumah's background to the background to Consciencism, which was published in 1964. That's after 7 years of Ghana's getting its independence. One thing we should take note or cognizance of that He's not just a political leader, but he's also tried to give intellectual or justification to Ghana and Africa's part. That's one that he's done. And then his write up on this consciencism was at a time where African leaders were trying to define what independence really means beyond just raising flags or parades in that manner. So I always say he was looking for philosophy and manifesto, and that it was not an abstract book only. Nkrumah wanted to do both philosophy grounded in Marxism, materialism, and African tradition, its manifesto, a guide for what policy and what African revolution. Example like unlike Plato's Republic, which is purely philosophical, Conscientism was meant to shape national policy because this was situated in the context of what the Cold War, where Africa became a battleground for the US and the USSR influence, and then Nkrumah leaned towards socialism, but tried to adapt it to for Africa. Yeah, and then the decolonization in terms of many African countries were gaining independence within the early 1960s. Yeah, so we'll be going through all this, but this is just to situate for you to understand the consciencism, because Nkrumah saw that, for example, Ghana was the spark for Africa's unity. So hence there is a need for a unifying word philosophy. That is why he brought this consciencism, and his main like goal or aim, I would say, is to give Africa its own philosophical or ideological foundation, not borrowed from Europe or the Middle East, but a third way that harmonized both African humanism, maybe Christian and Islam, into what a guiding ideologies, and we'll go through all that he says or he writes about as we carry on. We've moved from the background of conscientism to what is conscientism itself. What is it? And then as is defined as philosophy and ideology for decolonization and what and development. So conscientism, like in his book, depicts Nkrumah's personal what philosophy and ideology in the quest for what decolonization and then development in post-independent in Africa. And we all believe, and then it's in the view that we can describe it as a philosophy and ideology that we call socialism. Well, as I told you earlier, that he sees that the solution to be the African socialism. We'll talk about that in our subsequent slides. So the conscientism like frames most of Nkrumah's political actions. And one statement that would want at the end of the class you understand better is that he said, I'll always act according to my conscience. And perhaps you may end up agreeing that it will be one of the most proudest declaration you can make by anyone, or even as an African. So, as I said, Nkrumah spoke about three segments, and the first segment is the African traditional way of life or African traditional humanism, and then he spoke about European Christianity, and he spoke about the Islamic also factor or Islam. So, Nkrumah emphasized or placed uh, more focus. His more focus was the fact that he believed that every society needed a philosophy or an ideology, because to him he says that any society that does not have a philosophy is practically doomed. And then he was of the view that Africa had been more like a battleground where forces are emerging from, and that's how come that three segment I just spoke about came about. So we want to understand, what does he mean by the African way of life or African traditional humanism? What does he mean by European Christianity? What does he mean by Islam? What does he mean? So we're explaining what it means first, then we'll see the implications of what he said in our subsequent slides, or the crisis that what he said has led to in our subsequent slides. So I'm just trying to explain what the African way of life actually means to you, or means to in the view of Nkrumah. So he argued that the African way of life is characterized by the communism I've mentioned, the humanism, the egalitarianism, that Africans are passionate about each other, and they treat each other with respect, and then they see each other as the same. So the African is not greedy. The African sees themselves all to be equal and deserve equal rights and equal opportunity. The African is not wicked. He's not egoistic. He's not selfish. The African man who wishes good unto his fellow man. And then the fact that Africans care deeply for one another and treat each other as fellow humans. And then the fact that African is neither evil, is neither self-centered or greedy. Because he believed or he argued that the African placed a higher what a higher value on virtue, ideals of social fairness for all people, but they hold the belief that everyone is equal simply by virtue of what being a human being. And then the, he linked that there are Africans among us, that we Africans did not have this. So the African was free from prejudice. The Africans was free from exploitative ideas or marginalization or corruption, and so many on. So he says that the African way of life support what equality and what equity or equal treatment of what individual across gender, across religion or economic status or political affiliation or belief. So this is what he described as the African way of what of life. So this is what Nkrumah described as what as the African way of what of life. So moving to the second point, which is about the Euro Christianity. So I said he spoke about three segments. So the Euro Christianity over here is this. This is where Nkrumah believed that the spread of European Christianity was a major factor in the decline of the sense of African nationalism. So the penetration of colonialism, neo-colonialism, and then imperialism, whilst utilizing slavery as a tool, symbolized by Christian religion. So Nkrumah believed that religion was a tool created by the bourgeoisie, the elites, the rich, to what? To serve their own interests, and that the humanism, communism, and the egalitarianism of the African civilization are on opposition or are opposed line to what? To Christian European Christianity. Because according to Nkrumah, that European Christianity is a foreign doctrine. So we must approach it what? Deliberately. Because there were no class struggles in Africa before what? The arrival of the European Christianity. That's what he talks about that. But put this in mind. Even though Nkrumah says that there is no there is no Africa that can do away with Christianity and Islam. It is impossible to abolish those things in that context. He also admonished or accept the fact that we have to find a way around to harmonize and accommodate them in alliance with what? With the African traditional way of life. And then out of this, the problems where he also perceived from European Christianity that brought was like as in terms of the problems that it brought that led to a plague of Africa's fundamental problems in terms of colonization, neo-colonialism, imperialism, lack of development, and the lack of unity. In terms of the Islam, which he spoke about, Islamic influence which spread through trade route, and then now you find it scholarships, and then emphasizing communities and then faith. So you find an example like in northern Ghana, and then the Sahara regions, they were shaped by Islamic what laws and what and scholarships and all those things. So these are the things that he's talking about. This is the three segments that he refers to, that he thinks are shaping. So we will be looking at what the crisis. Now he's giving us what the three legs are, what it is, the African way of life, European Christianity, and Islamic influence. Now we're going to look at the crisis of what? Of consciencism, which is the traditional respect for community versus Western what individualism, the African spirit versus Christianity, socialist what egalitarianism versus what capitalist what competition. So Nkrumah, this particular crash is what he referred to as what the crisis of what personality in Africa. To move into the crisis of conscience, the consciencism of conscience in Africa. So since now we've understood the fundamental issues, which is the African way of life, European Christianity, we've understood it. Now we're going to look at what has this made like? What is the crisis? The crisis has to do with what colonialism and then what religion as distractors. So if you now understand what European Christianity is, if you now understand what Islamic tradition is, Islamic influence is, if you understand the African way of life, we now get to the point that we realize that Nkrumah argues that Africa's soul or conscience was split during colonialism, because the Christianity and then Islam was through significant, through some form of activities and all those things, they undermined African humanism. That they just didn't conquer Africa, they conquered the land. They conquered our minds and values. Because you realize that missionary schools taught lessons or taught things, people to be literate, but it was reinforcing obedience toward European authority. So even though they were teaching people about how to be literate and how to read and write, all this was also at the backdrop of having to inculcate in people the obedience of what of European authority. So that's one he talks about, and then the loss of traditional what communal identity. That the African life was once what guided by what communalism, shared land, extended family support, and the egalitarian what values. So the colonial structure replaced that with what individualism and self what heredity or self acclamation or class hierarchies. So Africa lost what its confidence in their heritage, and then they look to foreign system for what for validation. So you realize that chiefs were cohort into what colonial administration. They lost their what their communal rule, and then what became what colonial instrument. So when you look at the indirect rule where the British system was used to what through chieftaincy, you realize that the chiefs at the point lost their actual values, the African way of life, and they actually became more like an instructors to their colonial masters, which were just being used to pursue or move along or push the agenda. And then a clash of what of values, where Africans were pulled in different what directions. So you had the traditional values of what of cooperation versus Western capitalism, spiritual African worldview versus imported what religion, and the produced internal what internal conflation of identity. So sometimes you realize that sometimes you may feel caught between traditional expectations and then what and then Western ideas. That is what is the crisis of what of consciencism. That's what Nkrumah views as in the crisis of what of consciencism. That this is what it has actually what led to. It has brought about these things we are talking about, because you are not really proud of the African religion, right? But you are proud of others. You don't really think highly of yourself, because you've been oriented to also lose your sense of belief that you can actually what, do it by yourself. So you realize that the results of this disorientation is what Nkrumah calls the crisis of conscience or personality. Like the African didn't know whether to be African, to be European, or something in between. So this crisis led to what? That political instability, cultural diffusion, and what even what leadership failure, the crisis of conscientism or conscience in what in Africa. So Nkrumah's solution, if he says this is it, he showed us the African way of life. He's talking about European Christianity, Islamic influence. He's giving us a diagnosis, what it is, how it looked like, what brought about the issues, the crisis of conscientism. Then what is the solution that he proposes? He proposes what? A scientific socialism as the answer. Communalism is equal to what? African social political what? Ancestors of socialism. So for Nkrumah, the crisis of what? Conscience could only be resolved by what? Socialism. But not a, listen, but not a copy of the what? The Soviet or the Chinese socialism. He called it what? Scientific what? Socialism. Grounded in what? In material what? Conditions, guided by what? Reason and adapted to what? To Africa. So unlike capitalism, which will be competition and profit, socialism will focus on what? Collective ownership and what? And then what? Equality. And these values are what resonate what? With Africa, Africa's part. So you realize that the colonialism as Africa's communalism as Africa's heritage, where pre-colonial Africa was marked by communal what lives, shared land, collective farming, extended family system. So Nkrumah saw socialism as a modern extension of these same what echoes that I've just mentioned. So he often said that communalism is the social political ancestor of what of socialism. So if you take, for example, in the Akan setting, traditional Akan stool were held in trust for the community, similar to the socialist principle of what of public what ownership. Humanism with what modern what need. So he argued that Africa's traditional what society valued human dignity, sharing and what solidarity. So socialism from Nkrumah would emerge with these old values, with the demand of a modern what industrial what, economy. So this was an attempt to modernize without losing Africa's what identity. That is what, and then the unity, purpose, and what resource what control. So socialism could only succeed if Africa was united, as in the Pan-Africanism in Nkrumah's mind. So he requested for a common purpose, fighting what neo-colonialism and independence. That Africans must control their natural resources. Otherwise, independence is what is hollow or so is meaningless. So you realize that that is what led him to build something like the Ghana Volta River Oil project, the Hydro Dam, which was by Nkrumah socialist what vision, using resources to power development for all, not just what uh, foreign competitors, but for all. So this is the sense of solution that he Nkrumah envisioned to deal with what that conscientism, the African way of life that he thinks we've lost, and then the implications of conscientism. Nkrumah believed that independence was not just what political, but a mutual and philosophical. So Africa needs to decolonize the mind and reject feelings of what of inferiority, because conscientism was calling for a new African personality that blends traditional and modernity. Was Nkrumah insisted that the African university should not just copy Europe, but what should produce knowledge rooted in Africa's what reality. That was the implication of it. Intellectual what revolution. The African be able to think and do things in his own way to suit the African way of life. The implication of conscientism has to do with what economic self-reliance and resource what control. But the true independence is equal to what controlling Africa's gold, cocoa, oil, land, and all that. That neo-colonialism happens when foreigners exploit what Africa's resources, whilst Africa what remains poor. So conscientism argued that Africa what must own or must be eager to what own the means of production collectively. So you saw that under Ghana under Nkrumah's regime as president, you realize that Ghana made an attempt what under Nkrumah to industrialize and reduce what dependency on imported what goods. And this implication of conscientism also another point has to do with the Pan-African unity against what Neo-colonialism. So Nkrumah warned that Africa divided means we are weak and easily manipulated by global powers, which is true. So if you're able to stand on your ground, you have a huge voice and you're united, you are able to what, negotiate on the global stage better. So a united Africa could resist what a neo-colonial what pressure. So conscientism is providing as what the ideological what base for what the, for example, the OAU, which is the Organization of African what Union, that was in 1963. That was the implication of conscientism. Another implication of conscientism has to do with development policy what formulation, development policy formulation, which is that conscientism was not abstract. It was intended to what to guide actual policies, education, industries, foreign relation. So philosophy plus what practice, as I said at the beginning, like the building block for Africa's what development. So you realize that we had what a free compulsory education and infrastructure project in our early Ghana was rooted in socialism, where maybe people in the north were given that freely to go for to have basic education freely. That was the developmental policy what formulation stem from that. So these are what the implications of conscientism for the African continent: intellectual revolution, economic self-reliance, and then resource what control, Pan-African unity against what neo-colonialism, and then development what policy formulation. Then the confusion in conscientism. We are saying the criticisms, the critique. Some scholars say there is ambiguity in terms of the philosophy or the ideology. They say that conscientism is both an intellectual framework and political what guide, but critics argue that it is unclear whether Nkrumah meant it is a universal philosophy or a political tool for his CPP. And then this dual role makes it hard to categorize. That's according to scholars, or according to the critics. It's not all the critics you may agree with. There are some I may even disagree with, but that is some of the critique against Nkrumah's what political what ideology. And another point for his ideology is another point that he was criticized for was the harmonization of religion. The critics were saying that if you say Christianity and then Islam has not really helped, and it has a clash with African way of life or African way of life, then the question is, why do you then say we should blend them or blend this ideology? And they say it's not realistic, because if you are saying that something that is not good, if it's not good, then why do we have to blend them if it's not good? So there's another critique that people also would level against him, and people also level against him that there's a risk of authoritarianism application. So you see, under the CPP, under Nkrumah became a one-party state, right, in 1964. So critics argue that conscientism called for unity could be a use of silence opposition. How you getting me? Or silencing the opposition what in the name of what ideological what harmony. So that are some of the perspective of what of the critics on Nkrumah's what conscientism. And then the relevance today, resurgence of what Pan-Africanism. You've heard the issue of Africa should unite, Africans should come together, have one voice. So you realize that this particular theory still resonates in modern times, where these issues of Pan-Africanism is still on the table for Africa being unique, having a one voice as an ongoing debate on colonization, neo-colonizing, and the global capitalism. You've heard a lot of things about Africa asking for repatriation for colonial practices that was happening here, the exploitation that has happened here, climate change, and all those things. That should tell you that indeed the ideas of Confucianism of Nkrumah is still resonating and still relevant to today's what discussion. So we ask ourselves, can socialism be Africa's part? And as African what resolve its crisis of what conscientism? That's a question I'll leave for you to ponder over. That's a question I'll leave for you what to think about. And in my conclusion, or as we end, we say in the 21st century, Pan-African ideas are back in discussion. We have after African continental free trade area calling for African unity in global negotiation, climate, trade, and security. Youth movements, the year of return in Ghana, and SARS in Nigeria, Pan-African tweet activists, echoing what Nkrumah's vision of what solidarity. So looking at the African Union Agenda 2063, which is basically what a mode of Pan-Africanist what manifesto. So we are having debates on what neo-colonialism and what and capitalism, which Nkrumah warned of what of neo-colonialism, economic control what after what political independence. So today, still, Africa faces this problem. Foreign companies what dominating mining and oil sectors in Africa, dependency what debt dependency on IMF and World Bank and other what countries, influence of China, the US, Europe in trade and policy, and global capitalism remains what a double-edged sword, which is opportunities in the market but risks of what exploitation of the African. So you find Ghana cocoa farmer earn very little, whilst what the chocolate was what is a multi-million-dollar what profit what industry, but the farmer earns what little. So some of the questions we'll ponder, we'll ask ourselves, as I said, can socialism be Africa's path? Some will argue yes, it aligns with what communal African values. Others will say no, the world is not capitalist and what interconnected. Some will say no, that the world is now capitalist and interconnected, as the world is now capitalist and interconnected, so it can be done. And we ask ourselves, has Africa resolved a crisis of conscience or consciencism? Many Africans still struggle with what traditional, religious, and what modern Western values. Yet there is a growing confidence in what in African culture, Afrobeat, Nollywood, and indigenous what philosophies. So we'll say there's still hope, but it's a long way for us to go in reaching or reclaiming our conscience as Africans. These are some discussion questions you can ponder over as you think of Consciencism by Dr. Osajefo Kwame Nkrumah. And it's, you ask yourself, can African socialist societies truly would harmonize traditional values, Christianity and Islam? Was Nkrumah too idealistic or ahead of his time? Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was Africa's philosopher king. Discuss the claim that Osajefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah philosophical consciencism was ideological, idealistic, and above all, confused. These are all some questions you can ponder over in terms of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, in terms of his ideas of what? Of consciencism, and what you think of it as an African or as a non-African. How does this resonate with you? And how do you see the idea of consciencism? Is it realistic, or is it just a novelty that cannot be realized in this era or this generation? Kindly subscribe and like our YouTube channels and our video. Thank you very much.